Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the bill that before us, the Sovereign Wealth Fund of St. Lucia Act. But Mr. Speaker, permit me and grant me leave to just convey my condolences to 4 friends and stalwarts in the constituency of Castries Southeast: Dorothy Thomas of Cooleytown, Terence Edward of Wavin-Poisson, Russell Thomas of Cooleytown, and Mifa or Louis Etienne of Wavin-Poisson. These 4 individuals, Mr. Speaker, if I had my way, I would pen on the tombstone. They raised the scarlet standard high, and within its shades, they live and died. Mr. Speaker, and the more important and the substantive contribution have to do with the piece of legislation that is before us. Mr. Speaker, I really want to briefly support it from the perspective of the socio-economic realities of St. Lucia. Mr. Speaker, but I cannot help but to do what I really hate to do, is to describe what the member for Mikod South did a few minutes ago. And his presentation reminds me of someone dressed with a cowboy hat, cowboy clothing to a Western dance, and when he got there, they only played reggae. He announced what he was coming to do, but what he found here was something completely different. So honestly, that's what he reminded me of. Somebody dressed with large cowboy hat, the belt in his waist, his boots, to come to dance country and Western, but they only played reggae for the night. That's as best as I could describe him. But Mr. Speaker, just to remind us that there have been a few funds, and one of the funds that I reflect on and I need to remind us is the NIC. The NIC met tremendous opposition in establishing it, and today it is $2.2 billion strong as our main social protection system. Mr. Speaker, my support for the Sovereign Wealth Fund, and of course I heard the member he spoke of other funds, but I know we have the St. Lucia Social Development Fund, the National Economic Fund, and of course before we had SSDF, we had the Poverty Reduction Fund, and these were vehicles established to transfer and to impact the social landscape and to bring relief. But none of those funds stand as strong as the NIC as our main social protection support. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister spoke about how stubborn generational poverty is, and I would love to accentuate this point. And this morning I was happy when I met 2 of the students and I was introduced to them. I shared with them, I was introduced as the minister responsible for poverty reduction. And I told them that I was not only responsible for poverty reduction, but also to reduce vulnerability to poverty. Mr. Speaker, we have a poverty line established at approximately $500 to $600 monthly. And since independence, we have approximately 25 to 28% of our population below the poverty line. They live in there. It reflects how stubborn getting out of poverty is. Mr. Speaker, not only that poverty is stubborn, but persons who are above the poverty line, the middle class, they are vulnerable, very vulnerable. But that's not only reflected in the lives of the population. Our society, our island reflects that vulnerability, and we saw it at COVID. Had there been a sovereign wealth fund to respond to when COVID hit, the former government would not have been at this largesse of borrowing to the extent that it had to take the skill of this Prime Minister to bail us out. A sovereign wealth fund is very important especially at this time. Mr. Speaker, the cycle of poverty is clear in the lives of many St. Lucians. I speak to individuals and I understand it. Not that we cannot survive. And when I speak of poverty and vulnerability, I am not speaking of persons who are generally unhappy, because even while we are struggling, we learn to live happy lives and adapt to the situation. We do that. But Mr. Speaker, when the hurricane hits on a category 5, hits an island like Dominica, see what happened. The entire wealth of the country by its GDP was wiped off completely. And who suffered? And I remind members, Mr. Speaker, I was on the ground. I was on the ground, Mr. Speaker, and remember I was on the ground. You were there too. And we saw how quickly some people responded, but we also paid attention to how the middle class and those persons who contribute to the wealth and stability of the economy, how they stayed behind and languished. The leader of the opposition mentioned the issue of these events. But I support, in support not of what he said, but the purpose of this fund. It is to support investment in climate adaptation, climate mitigation, and sustainable economic development. One of the major shocks that reduce or makes the middle class vulnerability are these events, hurricanes, earthquakes, those natural disasters. Because, Mr. Speaker, there is a relationship in the economy between the working class, their livelihoods, and how they consume, and how they support the lower class. So when the hurricane hits, and Mr. Speaker, you can no longer go to work, you cannot work, go to the bank, WASCO can no longer employ you, you are unable to provide employment for your babysitter or the ones who come to provide support for you at your house. Mr. Speaker, when you take this significant population of your middle class being affected by these events, you could understand the pressure on your population. The NIC is not adequate to respond to all of these events at this time. And Mr. Speaker, I know that other persons will respond to some of the statement made. But one of the beauty of the Sovereign Wealth Fund, as described by the Prime Minister, is that whereas the former minister was able to go into NIC and get loan to give to a foreign entity in the name of carbon, that would not be, you wouldn't be able to do that in the Sovereign Wealth Fund. He wouldn't. And this Prime Minister has had to find ways of paying back monies withdrawn out of the NIC. But Mr. Speaker, I've been going around making some small presentations to young people on the issue of generational wealth on my own. Some of the things that I've said to them, Mr. Speaker, I will briefly mention it. Mr. Speaker, the stubbornness of poverty and the ills of poverty, it is systemic. It is documented that generational poverty is systemic. The very system that we rely on doesn't always get us out of our situation for obvious reasons. You buy a house, you take a mortgage, and by the time you're about to finish pay it, you either get a stroke, a heart attack, you're unable to go to work, God forbid. All of what you have invested now is at risk. and then your children who have left your home to mortgage, they cannot come and help you, and therefore the government is trying to provide support through all of our social protection means, having the elder care program, somebody's going to your home to support you. We have the public assistance program trying to respond to those at the bottom. This is the structure and the current arrangement of our economy. But this Prime Minister, the Minister of Finance, have recognized the importance of establishing another fund. And it is different to the NIC. It is different to the St. Lucia Social Development Fund. It is different to the National Economic Fund, because its perspectives specifically mention climate adaptation and mitigation, and it is projecting wealth creation at its core, not just for us. I noticed the leader of the opposition was so preoccupied with the Prime Minister having powers. This, through its regulations, may very well, when the board meets, to establish that the fund will come into use maybe 20 years from now, if that goes into the regulations. Or they may say it could only be used only after it reaches 150 million. Who knows? The board may decide on how this thing should operate, but it projects into the future. It may be associated with hurricanes, it may be associated with a number of issues, and not what the leader of the opposition was trying to suggest. Mr. Speaker, if you just take the example, and this is what I was trying to tell the two young students before we debated this bill, and this is what I've been sharing with a lot of young people these days. How do you avoid this issue of generational poverty? And I think St. Lucians listening should pay attention to what the government is trying to do and relate their own life, their personal life in a similar way. How do you avoid generational poverty? It means that if there are 6 of you at home, for the better good of the future of your other children, your cousins, you can create a fund specifically for the future, and everybody contribute to it. It could be 10 cents, 5 cents, it can be $10, it can be $20. Families must build bridges for the next generation. Families must agree not to just consume everything for today, but we are responsible for those who come after us. This Prime Minister is saying that while we are growing the economy, while we are seeing some prospects of doing good, we must put money somewhere for the future generation. I mean, I hope that the former Prime Minister never returns as Prime Minister of this island. But the Prime Minister is not doing something for himself or for himself as Prime Minister to rule over. Whatever he's suggesting, it may very well be some other leader to rule over it. Today we have the pleasure of having the NIC, but we were not the ones who established it. But look at so many persons benefiting from the NICs. It provides pensions. For persons who, lactative mothers, they are getting support. For certain persons who have lost their family members, they get burial support. And people actually have some form of livelihood after they have retired, because somebody saw the need to establish the National Insurance Corporation. Mr. Speaker, there ought not to be any doubt that this is novel, it is timely, and it is important. At a time when you do not find many friendly governments, you do not find institutions who are willing to support. But if this fund, as it designed under appropriate regulations, I believe one of these days, maybe we may not be there, but future generation will stand and say, thank God that there was a set of people who saw the need to establish the Sovereign Wealth Fund. With these few words, Mr. Speaker, I wish to thank the Prime Minister for having the foresight and going through the struggles in bringing this piece of legislation here today. And I ask St. Lucians if we need to tweak it to improve on it. But the objective, the heart, the motive behind the establishment of a sovereign wealth fund is to provide further security for a vulnerable people, for a small island developing state, as we move on, take responsibility for our way forward. Thank you very much.